Um, Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be rounding off the conference by continuing our tour of some of the fantastic Norwich buildings that we would have been able to visit in person. Very much following on from Anne's talk, which has given us a really good grounding in the post-medieval vernacular architecture of the city, particularly focusing on some of the smaller houses and also the buildings in the close. I will sort of round off the picture by focusing a little bit more on elite buildings, those belonging to the merchant class. I'm focusing today on the situation in the 17th century. And I'm starting perhaps slightly strangely by leaving Norwich just for a brief moment to show you this quote from Celia Fiennes on her visit through East Anglia at the end of the 17th century. Celia Fiennes was very attuned to architectural change and commented as she travelled through the country on building forms, those which she considered old-fashioned, and commenting favourably on buildings that were in the new mode of building. And here she's of course referring to the London development of brick, classical frontages, of symmetrical building designs, and she comments very favourably, for instance, on Cupola House, which has recently been built by an apothecary in Bury St Edmunds on her way to Norwich, and sort of highlights there this new form of building she comments on very favourably. We know a lot about, there's been increasing amount of work on 17th century urban buildings in England. We've got, for instance, Pam Graves's work on Newcastle and these Newcastle merchant houses built by a Puritan elite in the mid 17th century, with their windows looking out over the town square. And of course, we've recently had Roger Leach's brilliant book on Bristol, looking at both medieval and post-medieval houses, commenting on, for instance, the way in which medieval halls were kept and incorporated as signs of civic position and tradition, but how these were kind of replaced in the later 17th century by these row houses with their decorative timber facades as the main display of status and wealth. And this is a trend that I've focused on and identified in a similar vein in Norwich merchant houses. In the recent Vernacular Architecture Conference on room use, I spoke quite a lot about the later medieval and 16th century merchants' houses in the city, and that recording is available to you, so I'm not going to go over that too much today. But merchant houses in Norwich developed from their medieval forms, from these courtyard properties with their great halls, their undercrofts for display as well as storage. Great halls like this example at Strangers' Hall, which was rebuilt by a wealthy merchant in the mid 16th century, very much associated with the rise to civic office. And houses like this passed through generations of merchant families, through inheritance, through marriage, and through purchase. So at Strangers' Hall, the Southerton family who rebuilt the hall. The house was then sold to Francis Cock, who added the front porch with the royal insignia and inserted the staircase into the Great Hall, and kept the medieval kind of features of this space to highlight the kind of antiquity and longevity. And this is a theme that was continued when Joseph Payne purchased the house in 1659. Repainted the fireplaces with his wife's, him and his wife's initials, as Andrea showed us earlier. And buying this house was a mark of his return to favour. He was a Conservative alderman who'd been ejected during the Civil War years and was now back in, and became the first mayor of the city after the Restoration. So these houses are part of a wider phenomenon that Vic has talked about, the construction of civic memory in Norwich the way in which the civic elite formed a corporate body and invested in all of the material trappings that go with that, including a big investment in memory through civic portraiture, with paintings commissioned of earlier civic fathers. And I've argued that the houses of the merchant elite served a very similar purpose in the 16th and early 17th centuries. They are decorated with the insignia and dates of the leading families. They pass through different merchant families and form a public and private history inscribed on the urban landscape. And this was very much an important part of maintaining the authority of the civic elite during the medieval and post-medieval period. If we move then thinking a bit more about the 17th century, this is Norwich's greatest period of prosperity, with the boom in the worsted trade from the late 16th century onwards. Norwich is the second city of the realm. It has a massive population growth, as Anne has already talked about. Its trade is very, very significant. And visitors to the city comment on its wealth, its prosperity, but also on its distinctive urban landscape. They're impressed by its civic and religious buildings, and they comment on the amount of open space there is in the city. The walled area covers an area greater than London, although the population is obviously only about a tenth of the population of London. And that led to this quite spreading development of plan forms and houses with a large amount of open space around the edges of the city right up until the late 18th century. And we do have this sequence that Anne showed us of an increasingly densely occupied urban landscape in the centre. As that population growth was accommodated, it was mainly among the poorer elements of society. There was increasing polarisation here, and the owners of urban plots are taking advantage of this situation by subdividing buildings, building extensions into yards. So we've got workshops that are then turned into cottages and houses that are subdivided, and we can see that in the archaeological record in various parts of the city. Here is Alms Lane that Anne showed us earlier, where we see this increasing densification of building, and Plunkett's photographs show us some of these buildings as they still survived before they were torn down in the slum clearances of the 20th century. Again, north of the city, where we have a lot of excavated evidence, the pattern is the same. We also have a lot of evidence of shared yards, shared wells, shared cesspits in these urban tenements. And we know that conditions were becoming, for the people in these areas of the city, increasingly overcrowded. We've got significant outbreaks of plague. A lot of this has been driven by the immigration of that large Dutch and French Walloon population in the late 16th and early 17th century. So the development of these courtyards often formed out of these earlier mercantile courtyard properties, and the infilling of side lanes with these two-storey cottages is a feature that we see across the city. Most of these have now gone, and they've recorded in Plunkett's photographs. We spoke about dormers earlier, and as Anne says, it's a really distinctive feature of Norwich's 17th century urban landscape, the use of dormers. And we had a question earlier about the extent to which these are associated with the weaving industry. I think there is an association, and there must be, because, you know, worsted weaving was the city's primary occupation, and so the looms must have been somewhere, and the garrets do make sense as weaving spaces. There is an association in probate inventories with looms and garrets, although it's not an exclusive relationship. Some of them do have large windows that would support their use as a workshop space. There's a nice example here in St Andrew's Hill of these double and triple dormers being added to earlier buildings with the good capacity for workshop space. But large windows are not always found in these dormers. I think we can't be definitive about their use as weaving workshops, but I think it must have been relatively common that they were. And again, as Anne has already outlined, over the course of the 17th century, we do see some shifts in the vernacular architecture in Norwich, away from the use of timber upper floors and jetties to mass walling in flint rubble with brick detailing. Sometimes just quoins, quite often with a fairly simple brick platband running through the building. Occasional use of features such as crow-step gables and decorative features such as that. And these examples here at King Street and St George's Street are very much on the outskirts of the city. They're in the they're not in the city centre. So this sort of improved quality of building or investment in mass walling is happening quite widespread through the social scale. But moving on to the more elite buildings, we've got all the way up to the aristocracy and gentry through to our merchant and middling sort builders. So we can start with the Duke of Norfolk, who had a palace in the city centre by the River Wensum. Very little of this building, nothing has survived of it above ground. There has been some archaeological evidence for it. We do have these depictions of its 17th century form. Very favourably commented on by Celia Fiennes in terms of its architectural style. Less favourably commented on by many authors who comment on it, the fact that it's in the city centre near the river, not particularly grand surroundings for a ducal palace, and I think it was Defoe who said it was situated in a dunghill of a place. Other aristocratic building activities associated in particular with the sites of the dissolved monastic houses. So the house of Henry Howard, who's a younger branch of the Duke of Norfolk family, built a mansion residence, of which the garden house, some kind of summer house feature, rather big for a summer house, a kind of lodge building almost, we might describe it, survives in King Street with its grand 17th century staircase rising up. And this is bringing in that use of classical brick style of architecture. Nearby, further down King Street, we have Wensum Lodge, a very interesting building. It's one of the oldest standing buildings in Norwich, because in the far gable end there is a 12th century stone undercroft house there. It was extended in the 15th century, and then in the 17th century the property was bought by the Paston family, one of Norfolk's most prominent gentry families, and it became their townhouse, and they are responsible for putting on this brick frontage with its prominent Mannerist style brick decorative gables, trying to unify what was quite a disparate series of blocks and spaces within this large former merchant's property. Anne's already showed us some of the smaller buildings in the close, but the close is the other area where we get the early introduction of these gentry forms of architecture, moving away from the timber framing towards brick and flint frontages, a certain degree of symmetry, rows of gables, sometimes decorative gables, which we see in gentry buildings in the countryside in the 17th century. The close is really the only area where we have a concentration of these in 17th century Norwich. So I'm showing you a few examples here. And then by the time we get to the end of the 17th century, numbers 3 and 4, the close, built for the wealthy Vin family, have what has become, as I will show you, a standard kind of Norwich form of building with these rows of gables decorating the frontage. We also need to think about the suburban context. So some wealthy families are also building suburban mansions or lodges. So we have the house of the Sir Edward Paston on the outskirts of Norwich in the village of Thorpe, which is just east of the city. And Brackendale to the south of the city, we have a series of buildings which have, again, these early examples of these brick, decorative, mannerist style use of brick architecture, in this case built by a merchant's widow and Kemp as a sort of suburban lodge type space. But Celia finds comments that for most of the case in Norwich, all of their buildings are of an old form, mostly in deep points and much tiling. So she's commenting on the continuation of this older form of urban architecture with its jetties and its gables. She comments on some of the decorative finishes that are applied to buildings in the city, including the use of plaster struck out to look like stone, and there's a few surviving examples of that. This is a building that Andrea showed us earlier with a wall painting on the ground floor. This is on the corner of Elm Hill, and was the home of the Mayor Robert Bendish in the 1680s. But you can see here it's a timber frame house that has that decorative pargeting to look like stone. And Fiennes does comment that some they do build in the new London fashion, building high, contracting the roofs in brick beyond the river. And she comments on these are being built by some wealthy factors. And Norwich was directly connected to London. That was where most of Norwich's worsted was going by the late 17th century, rather than directly across the sea. So there is a strong mercantile connection there. An example of this, we have 20 Colgate, which has a 17th century rear range with a staircase turret. And then in the mid 18th century, a brick frontage put on there with these large pilasters decorating the front. Next door to that is 18 Colgate, which again from the front, this is sort of 1720s, has that sort of perfect sort of Georgian classicizing frontage, but from the rear originally had a more vernacular style mannerist with these gables, and that's facing the river, of course. So there is that kind of hybrid period at this junction of the late 17th, early 18th century, where these classical forms are being worked through. Augustine Stewart's house, which again Anne showed us, started as a 16th century timber frame building, was raised and heightened and rearranged inside in the early 17th century. And it shows us the use of decorative features like these pedimented window cases, which originally appeared on the front. And we see lots of examples of these in illustrations of the city. So this is the very grand market cross, but behind you will see, decorating some of the market fronting buildings, these decorative window pediments. And we have a few surviving examples like these on Colgate, which are dated 1660. So this is a single cell building, quite a substantial one, however, clearly a member of the middling sort, I would say, rather than one of the poorer members of the urban community living here, and certainly with an investment in decorative features like these fashionable pedimented windows. This view of Kirkpatrick, by Kirkpatrick, of the city wall shows the development of this form of building with these rows of gables as something that's quite distinctive at the end of the 17th century and early 18th century. And we've seen examples of rows of dormers being added to two-story buildings to almost create a third story within former attic spaces. And these rows of interconnected dormers are quite common. They're made in different materials, so most of them are timber and plaster. We have an example here on King Street, which is has been added in brick to an earlier flint walled range. So you can see that you are effectively creating a third story within the roof space using this form. By the time we get to 1700, these examples on Timber Hill are fully three-story buildings, and the gables have become these sort of vestigial decorative features on what are otherwise flat-fronted buildings. And again, Anne's already shown us these examples on King Street with their curvilinear gables as a kind of final version of the form. And then by the time we get to the early 18th century, we're moving into the realm of polite architecture. Again, the continuing use of these quite substantial moulded brick decorative elements. These are both 1710, 1720 buildings. So that kind of lavishness on the frontage doesn't disappear completely until a bit later in the 18th century. These are obviously houses belonging to quite wealthy merchant or gentry families. And we can see that in this first, well, not first, but one of the early plans of the city, Corbridge's plan of 1727, which shows around the edge of the city plan some of its most important buildings, including the cathedral and the Guildhall and its churches. But then around the outer edge, we have examples of some of the wealthier merchant houses. And you can see here there's a mixture of some more obviously classical style Georgian buildings, but then quite a large number of these, of a continuation of these later 17th century buildings with their flat fronted gables, rows of dormers. So we're capturing that point in the city when these two kind of styles are in flux. And I just wanted to finish by talking about some of the possible influences on this early brick classical style architecture in the city, by focusing on some more unusual examples of buildings that kind of bring in this use of brick. And these are the early nonconformist meeting houses, which interestingly enough are all located in the area north of the river, where Celia Fiennes noted that predominance of new London forms of building, and that was an area that was associated with nonconformists in the city. It's away from the cathedral and the principal market square. So the first purpose-built meeting house, which was put up as soon as the Act of Toleration was declared in 1689, was the Presbyterian on Colgate, again directly opposite those merchant houses that I showed you earlier, which we know from Kirkpatrick's sketch was a brick building with its mullion and transom windows, a mixture of kind of gabled and hipped roofs. It does seem to be a bit of a mixture. It's specified as pantiles, interestingly, and there is that Dutch influence which between the nonconformist churches as well, which I think is another interesting thing to think about. And the location of these is quite interesting. So the Presbyterian meeting house was then replaced by the Octagon Chapel in the 1750s. Next door to it was the primary Congregationalist or independent meeting house, and that survives, and that has the first use in Norwich of these grand two-story pilasters along the front of the building. And these are originally it had sort of 17th century mullion and transom windows that have later been replaced by these Georgian sashes. And of course, these are very distinctive types of buildings of worship. They're purposefully different from the medieval Gothic Anglican churches. They're making a statement of difference here through the use of this classicizing architecture for a place of worship, which I think is quite interesting. And the Quakers, despite their reputation for plainness in Norwich, the Quakers by the 1690s are building on the Gildencroft a large brick meeting house, which again has these pilasters which are being copied from the They're slightly plainer, but they are copied from the Congregationalist meeting house that was a few years earlier. Only the bottom half of that building now survives. But I think there's almost the creation of a kind of nonconformist style here, which is quite interesting, and it links up to that London connection, and kind of makes sense why we might have that clustering of that early brick classicizing architecture in this area north of the city in the late 17th, early 18th century. I think, yeah, I think I'll finish there, and I'm happy to answer questions.